Let me officially welcome you to the Technology and Infrastructure Working Group session. I'm so humbled to be here with all of you. We're so glad you're here. You certainly don't need to be a technology expert either to participate in this session. So stick with us. We want to get your thoughts and feedback on what we have to put forward. So for this session, we're going to walk through our goals as a work group, what we mean by technology and infrastructure in the context of 911, the key questions we dug into together as a group, and then our process for arriving at our recommendations. And then perhaps most importantly and excitingly, we'll share with you the recommendations themselves that we've come up with and get your feedback on them, including how we should continue to improve them. These are draft one, and we want to work with you to get to the next draft. As we're getting started, I do want to invite you to share in the chat where you're joining from if you have not already. We have people from all over the country here, and that's one of the things that makes this effort powerful. So first, let Mike and I introduce ourselves. My pronouns are she, her. My name is Meredith Horowski, and I'm calling in from sunny Washington, D.C. It's a lovely day today. I'm excited for this conversation. I am an organizer, an advocate, a campaigner by background. I've spent my career mobilizing communities, particularly at the grassroots level, behind movements for justice. I'm currently the senior program director for the network at Code for America, where I work to support volunteers all across the country who use their technology skills to help their communities, both locally and nationally. Let me hand it over to Mike.
Thanks, Meredith. My name is Michael Cowden. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm calling in just across the river from Meredith in Falls Church, Virginia. I've got a background in internet and telecommunications technology dating back almost 3 decades now. And for the past few years, I've been working pretty extensively on automating the clearance of criminal records in about a dozen different states as part of the Clean Slate Initiative, to give folks a chance at second chance at housing, education, and employment opportunities. And I'm currently the Director of Solutions Engineering at Code for America. And yeah, looking forward, as Meredith said, to learning more about you all in the chat.
Great. Next slide, please. I'd now like to virtually introduce you all to our fellow working group members who have spent dozens and dozens of hours over the last few months lending their expertise, their feedback, their connections, their vision for a better future to this working group. They come from a variety of professional and personal backgrounds, and none of this today that we're presenting would be possible without them. So thank you all deeply from the bottom of our hearts for your work with us. And many of them are here with us today, so thank you for being here. So I want to thank Ben, Dave, Jerry, Brian, Dave, Jim, Christine, Jake, Kevin. Next slide. And then also thank you to Micah, Lauren, Seema, Robin, Billy, George, Scott, and Jesse. We so appreciate you and your contributions to this group. Next slide, please.
So over the past few months, in our work group, we've been exploring the role technology plays in transforming 911. And specifically, our goals have been to generate discussion and share the expertise of our work group members, identify the impact technology has on the capabilities of emergency communication centers, establish what is known about 911 technology infrastructure as it stands today, identifying what's working well and what's not working so well for ECCs, callers, responders, and the communities they serve, with the ultimate goal being to produce recommendations for systemic change. Next slide.
For those of you who are process lovers like me, I wanted to voice over what our process has looked like over these last several months. So with the help of course, Transform911 and also the Full Frame Initiative, we've undergone a pretty intensive process to understand the role technology and infrastructure plays in this ecosystem. And then from there, develop recommendations that are people first and focused on delivering outcomes for our communities and for those of us working within these systems every single day. So we started in the fall with the Transform911 convening back in September as a launch pad, which many of you were there for. We heard from many of you in breakout sessions about key topics that you thought each work group should focus on that guided the early work of each working group. From there, we formed our working groups comprised of folks from a diversity of professions and backgrounds with expertise to bring to bear. We then conducted a literature review, which you'll hear more about. Together, we surfaced what we know, what's working, what's not, success stories. We did what felt like countless interviews. It's probably about over 30 interviews and information gathering in one-to-one conversations to surface insights and ideas for transformation related to technology and infrastructure. And then we had design sessions to form the recommendations themselves. We asked each other hard questions. Is this really a good idea? What's the impact of this going to be? These are some of the questions we want to ask you today. We asked for feedback on these recommendations from reactors, including those who will be most impacted by these recommendations. And this convening is a key ingredient of that as well, to generate feedback and discussion for our next phase. And then together, we're going to iterate to develop final recommendations. I want to again emphasize that these are our first drafts, and this convening is intended to be part of the design process in which we are working through the next set of recommendations together, and we need your help to do that. Next slide, please.
And in our work group discussions and the follow-up interviews with stakeholders that Meredith just mentioned, a few key themes emerged. We discussed support for social reform and culture change in emergency response. We explored technology's role in people-first emergency response that sends the right response to the right person at the right time. We discussed the incredibly expensive and fragmented vendor landscape around emergency response, spoke to the challenges of incomplete and inconsistent data, as well as limitations of data transparency in the space. We explored the possibility around data standardization and related ethical considerations, talked about how to leverage existing technology and infrastructure to maximize the potential of next-gen 911, and acknowledge the interdependencies between 911 infrastructure and interoperability with the governance models imposed on ECCs themselves. Finally, we looked for success stories that we could lift up, highlighting what's working well in emergency response that we may be able to replicate. Next slide, please.
So I mentioned as part of our process, we did a literature review. So I want to talk a little bit about what surfaced from that exercise. I also want to give a hat tip to Natalie Warren for quite a bit of labor on that. So thank you, Natalie, and others for helping to put that together. So here's what the research says, that the degree of technological sophistication varies greatly among ECCs. Many of you who work in ECCs, this probably feels very obvious, but I think it's important to state that we're coming from a variety of different contexts and circumstances within ECCs when we think about technological sophistication. Also, technology advances pose challenges. We know that more antiquated analog systems have difficulty communicating with callers who are not using landlines, who are using mobile devices. And that's just one example. We also know that, of course, new technologies present opportunities. And that can look like improved service for interoperability, data sharing, data handling capabilities. We know that next-gen 911 is difficult to achieve for ECCs that have older systems, limited resources. We heard this time and time again that we need more funding for next-gen 911. Technology can aid rerouting of 911 calls to alternative hotlines and vice versa. And there's questions around how we equip alternative hotlines with location finding capabilities without violating the privacy of callers or inhibiting hotline usage. So these are a few themes that emerge from that literature review in terms of what the research says. I'd be curious for those of you who are well-versed in technology in 911, what else would you add to this? I invite you to put that in the chat in terms of the research that you've come across or experienced yourself day to day. All right, we're going to start to get to the extra juicy stuff, which is our recommendations for discussion. So these are a few of the recommendations that the technology work group has developed through this process. So in the interest of time, we're going to lift up, as I mentioned, just a few of them for today's conversations, and all of them are going to be available on the Transform911 website after the convening. And there's going to be mechanisms for you to upvote recommendations, provide additional thoughts through a form, and help us improve these. So we're going to have some specific questions after we walk through these one by one to get your reactions to. So we're going to tee up some questions to help you give us feedback on these. So I'm going to voice over them now so that you have the opportunity to hear these out loud, hear how they land, and that can help shape our conversation for the rest of the session. So the first one, Define, adopt, and implement uniform data standards for call data to enable government transparency, achieve equity, and improve outcomes of emergency response. Second recommendation, develop and publish a data ethics statement to ensure the appropriate and ethical use of personal information in emergency service decision-making. Our third recommendation, empower and incentivize ECCs with modern tools by using dedicated shared service models and cloud-based services to improve consistency and quality of service. And the fourth one for today, require vendors to provide real-time access to call data for reporting and analytics to support continuous improvement efforts for call outcomes, professional development, and operational efficiencies. So the next part of our session today, we're going to talk through each of these recommendations in a little bit more detail, and then we're going to tee up those discussion questions for all of you to help provide feedback on these recommendations. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Mike.
Thanks, Meredith. One of the recurring themes that we in our workshop or in our work group around 911 technology was the challenge around call data, the lack of consistency and uniformity across agencies and across jurisdictions, and the barriers that creates for interoperability, transparency, and the ability to make informed decisions about emergency response. And there's a lot of work that's been done over the years on data standardization that I want to acknowledge, and that work is ongoing. We're closely watching 911.gov's data path project, the CAD interoperability standards coming out of the IGES Institute, and the large body of work from NINA and APCO over the years. But a key point here is that Next-Gen 911 core services only cover a tip of the iceberg when it comes to call data. There are important details around interoperability that are still pretty opaque and that remain vendor specific and implementation dependent. And there's an opportunity here for greater standardization and greater transparency. And of course, that comes with a pretty huge caveat, which is not all data can or should be shared. And there are efforts to clarify the specifics around this, around data roles and permissions that's being done by the data path project I mentioned just a moment ago. But it's important to reiterate that just because data can be shared doesn't mean that it should be shared. And this has real world implications when we're talking about privacy considerations of crisis hotlines or 988 services versus the expectation of 911 centers may have around data. And that's why we're also recommending the development of a more formal data ethics statement around emergency call information and its appropriate use. Next slide, please.
All right. So this recommendation, again, require vendors to provide real-time access to call data for reporting and analytics to support continuous improvement efforts for call outcomes, professional development, and operational efficiencies. So let's talk about this one. Maybe this one feels a little bit spicy. Maybe it feels just right. In our work group conversations, in the literature review, in our one-to-ones, this theme came up over and over and over again, which was lack of access to real-time data. We recognize that some of you and some ECCs have to jump through a lot of hoops to get access to their data from vendors. And sometimes that's months and months after that data actually happened, after those incidents happened. And this leads to opaqueness in where calls are coming from, what the community needs are. It creates barriers to making decisions based on the needs of our communities. On the flip side, we saw as we conducted dozens of interviews that many ECCs are really shining examples of how we can serve communities effectively and meet community needs. And access to call data is a huge piece of that. ECCs are then able to get information about call types, wait times, locations, and more that help directors make real-time staffing decisions, adjust resources, and help solve problems. You'll hear from Tyrell later today, and I think him and his team are one example of how they use real-time data and analysis tools to make dozens and dozens of decisions every single day that allow them to serve New Orleans more effectively. So our recommendation has a few elements of this. So when procuring Next-Gen 911 and CAD vendors, ECCs should demand open and efficient access to their data for real-time access for reporting and analytics. Importantly, the current status quo of data ownership is not enough. Often this is kind of contractual language that only allows data access once the relationship with the vendor has ended. Also, when working with cloud-based vendors, the option of local mirroring of data should be provided for secure and efficient reporting and analysis. And data should be fully exportable to avoid potential vendor lock-in practices. So we're really eager to hear your feedback on this one, including the implications from your perspective, which we're going to help, again, tee up some questions to get your feedback in this next part. And I see a chat message here from Dan that says the vast majority, more than 75% or 70% of ECCs are small, with less than 3 positions, and thus have less bandwidth, fewer resources to comply with additional technical and operational requirements. These ECCs and PSAPs are often forgotten because they don't end up getting interviewed in focus groups. This is such a great segue to our next section. So I think that's a perfect opportunity to hand this over to Mike, who's going to talk about our next recommendation. And this is exactly the kind of thing we want you to surface throughout this conversation and in our discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely one of the things that we kept running up against in our work group. And it kind of comes down to the interplay between and dependencies between 911 infrastructure and governance models, and the fact that right now there's well over 6,000 public service answering points in the U.S. And I have 80%, perhaps it's 70% of those are incredibly small. We're talking about 1 to 3 people answering the phones, often a landline handset. And this hyper-fragmentation of emergency response is a relatively unique challenge to the US compared to other countries like Australia or the UK. And it creates a huge barrier to modernization and interoperability. So we actually wanted to look at 2 things with respect to this. Number one, the opportunity to leverage more cloud-based services or hybrid models to provide smaller ECCs with more modern emergency response technology. And number 2, shared services models. ECCs is a dedicated service to first responders like police, fire, EMS, and social services, often across jurisdictions. Because this is an area we've actually seen real success. In Orleans Parish Communications District in New Orleans, processing over 1 million calls annually, and Chagrin Valley Dispatch in the Cleveland area, servicing 26 different municipalities and over 125,000 residents. And we wanted to note that this dedicated and independent model really does provide the best opportunity for success from a technology perspective, the best chance at modernization, redundancy, improved service on the line, response times, and ultimately lives saved. And really our biggest operational challenge is this fragmented environment for technology infrastructure and governance. And that's why we believe that these independent, dedicated state-run emergency communication centers are the best way to approach modernization, standardization, and interoperability challenges around 911. Next slide, please.
All right, so we're really just scratching the surface on what technology can do with emergency response, as many of you have directly experienced. So there's a couple main areas we want to watch in the future around access to opt-in data and machine learning technology. So one reality is that close to 80% of 911 calls are coming in over mobile phones. Initially, what began as a huge data challenge is now related to geolocation challenges in particular. We're also starting to flip the conversation. We're now talking about mobile devices being able to provide more information more accurately and in real time to telecommunicators and responders. And this also has implications for accessibility, native language support, personal health information, the ability for our mobile devices to share this data with ECCs to make more informed emergency response decisions. The other main area of focus for further research is around AI and machine learning. With more and more data becoming available to ECCs, we want to know, how can technology make sense of that data to ensure faster, more informed and effective decision making? Are there opportunities to triage non-emergency calls with AI and provide even faster and more effective diagnosis and life-saving measures for specific health emergencies like cardiac arrest or stroke? These are areas where AI and machine learning show promise and are already being used in other major countries. And one last point, we actually think there's an opportunity to become more proactive and preventative in this space. Are there ethical and non-intrusive ways to determine patterns around emergency response, particularly for mental health and substance abuse related issues that allow us to intervene with care and caretaking measures before situations escalate to 911? So these are some of the open questions and calls for future research that we've discussed. And again, importantly, we want to know what else would you add to this list? What else do you think needs to be explored further within this category of technology and infrastructure? All right, so that concludes the sort of like information sharing portion of the discussion today in terms of how we got where we are, what are some of the things on the table and why, and now we get to the good part, which is some discussion from all of you. So there's three primary questions that we want to surface for your input. One is, what is the potential impact of these recommendations? We want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly. We want to know now, how is this going to impact folks from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives and experiences within this system and within our communities? So that's the question one. What's the potential impact of these recommendations? The second is, based on your experience, where should we look for inspiration related to the implementation of these recommendations? For example, other communities or issue areas or discrete ECCs who are excelling at data standardization or vendor requirements or shared service models. And then finally, and importantly, what would make you more supportive of these recommendations? So potential impact, where should we look for inspiration, and what would make you more supportive? So what we're going to do is take each of these questions one at a time and have you type in via the Mentimeter platform your responses to these questions. We invite you to respond to the recommendations as a whole or to one individual recommendations you want to react to for each question. And I think Melissa is going to help us out by pasting the recommendations in the chat, so you have those in front of you again. And then we'll launch the Mentimeter to invite your responses to these questions, with that first question being, what is the potential impact of these recommendations? So go ahead and click that link, the Mentimeter link in the chat. Melissa, please share with us those recommendations in the chat. I'll also read them aloud for those of you where that's easier for you. Define, adopt, and implement uniform data standards for call data to enable government transparency, achieve equity, and improve outcomes of emergency response. Second recommendation, develop and publish a data ethics statement to ensure the appropriate and ethical use of personal information in emergency service decision-making. Modern tools by using dedicated shared service models and cloud-based services to improve consistency and quality of service. And then the one that I characterize as maybe a little spicy, you want to get your take, is require vendors to provide real-time access to call data for reporting and analytics to support continuous improvement efforts. And so those are pasted here in the chat. Also, here's that Mentimeter link again to type in your response to the question, what is the potential impact of these recommendations? So what we'll do is give folks a few minutes to react to these. We'll see the Mentimeter populate, and then we'll work to kind of surface some themes that are going to help us drive the next iteration of our recommendations. There's some really good stuff coming in here. I'm going to hold the voiceover for another 30 seconds or so, just to give people time to think, to type in your thoughts. All right. Can the wonderful folks running the Mentimeter scroll up a little bit and work to surface some themes here? So potential impacts of these recommendations: standardizing access to care. One, expense of converting systems when municipalities are cash strapped. Absolutely, I think related to technology recommendations and many others, how this is going to be funded, and how do we create the infrastructure where resources can be shared, particularly for smaller ECCs that are already really under-resourced, essential. Standardization is beneficial, but we also need to ensure that location-specific needs are accounted for. Absolutely. Someone who does organizing work at both the national and local level, the uniqueness of each community, there needs to be space for that to show up in all kinds of ways. Another one here about the financial impact. Yeah. Encourage consolidation of ECCs to improve access and technology. Let's see, what else? One potential caution is redundant standards that aren't universally adopted. And would that create conflicting standards and regimes? Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Any standard that's created needs to be done in the context of other standards that already exist, and how would they work together or complement one another? I'm seeing something this would help improve the technical qualifications of this role, and it would open up and be more attractive to other job backgrounds. Help hold vendors accountable. Absolutely, that's a big one here. Political opposition to ECC consolidation. That's something we heard over and over again in our conversations, that needs to be managed incredibly carefully. And some ECCs that have managed consolidation well, I think, have some good insights on how that can be done. Mike, I want to invite you to voice over any of these or reflect on any themes you're seeing.
Absolutely. I think that some of the other themes seeing here is just around, if you scroll back up to the top, there is one around artificial intelligence and bias. And I think that's certainly something we're thinking a lot about in terms of ethical access to data and ethical use of data, and how can we make sure that we're not inserting implicit bias or unintentional bias into this problem in any way. I think there's also, if scrolling down a little bit further, I think there are some other conversations around this, around data access and where there may be pushback to that. Yeah, so requiring access to data while maintaining discretion. So it's certainly, I think, riding that fine line of privacy and open access that can help push the needle on what we're able to do with data.
See one interesting one here, which if you scroll up a little bit, that the potential impact of these recommendations might be better public opinion of emergency response services, including 911 services. This is all really wonderful. Again, the organizer in me is just so excited about the power of people coming together with diversity of perspectives and backgrounds around a shared goal, and how that is essential to creating solid recommendations, but more importantly, things that can stick within our communities. Seeing potential impact is greater interoperability. If we pause on that one, it's the yellow one on the left. Scroll up a tiny bit. Interoperability was one of the things that came through just incredibly vividly in our first convening back in September. We did a word cloud, and it may have been the biggest word in the word cloud. So that feels important, that a potential impact of these recommendations is greater interoperability. And feature forward vendor requirements could allow for greater flexibility, modularity, and risk mitigation to avoid vendor lock-in. Fully support more open data as a much wider range of stakeholders without the burden of going through public records requests and multi-year-old data. Greater control of data. As a researcher, I'm sympathetic. Oh, I think we scrolled past that one. Okay, let's talk about some objections. We've talked about a few already. Biggest objections are that one size does not fit all, along with financial. If ECCs were state funded and operated, would put them in a more even playing field. It would not be dependent on an individual agency needs and funding or biases. Yeah, and I think a question for this group is like, is the field trending, in that direction? From our perspective, it seems like it is, in terms of more consolidation of ECCs and of regional entities, as we've seen some success around the country. I want to point to Chagrin Valley Dispatch again. There's many others, and we recognize that may be a long road. So how do we serve smaller ECCs and folks who are under-resourced in the meantime? And I think the shared service models is a piece of that, and we need to figure out how that would work, how to implement that effectively. I think this is a really great point. Oh yeah, here's a good one. A requirement is only as strong as the enforcement. How will vendors be held accountable to share data? What are the enforcement mechanisms? I think this is essential. I think some of the other working groups have some great recommendations along this lines of what enforcement would look like and what it would look like to have more political resources and infrastructure at the national level supporting 911, supporting ECCs. I think is one ingredient of this, but yeah, I really appreciate whoever flagged that one.
I think another point on that is sometimes it's, when there's federal funding that comes across, that comes as part of these infrastructure initiatives, how can that be tied to this sort of accountability to make sure that that we are creating more systems that are more open. Another thing I wanted to read through here was data is just data without context. The impact will be transforming the data into meaningful information that can be used to affect policy and operational changes to enhance response and outcomes. Yeah, so I think I'm curious about, from professionals in the industry, about how they look at data and how the lens that they view that through to what would be helpful in terms of data analyses and visualizations on that data. I'd be very curious to know what folks feel about that particular issue.
Something that I think Dan lifted up in the chat, I want to read it out loud for the group, which is related to AI. Bias is especially difficult in 911 because the feedback loop has to encompass the entire criminal justice stack, all the way to prosecution and conviction. Right now, there's no mechanism for this. Yeah, absolutely. What an important point. I think that underscores something that we heard again and again, which was the lack of some of these feedback loops, even at the level of call takers, sort of not knowing what happens to the people in that situation, or to the callers. And having those feedback loops would allow us to make better decisions about, did we have the right information on the front end? Did we deploy the right resources? How can that be improved? what's going well and what needs to be, done more of. That's only one small element of the point you raise about the sort of end-to-end process of the criminal legal system. But I think this larger point about feedback loops and how tricky that can be is essential. And also, would love to see what are the small steps we can take to get us closer to those outcomes where we can have that visibility in those end-to-end processes.
There was another comment made around the tension between AI and machine learning and people-centered first, second response that was discussed yesterday. So I think that's part of the reason why this is in our calls for further research. And really the goal is to drill down to what are the very specific areas where this technology might be useful in a human-centered way. And I think there are a lot of considerations that we have to take into it, ethical considerations and potential impact of using technology like this for either analyzing data on the back end to determine patterns, or being used to augment first respond, telecommunicators in taking calls.
I see one here, data principles like the ones passed in the EU must be required. Love a good firm proposal. Great. This is so exciting and such a treasure trove of perspective of the impact of these potential recommendations. I want to encourage you to keep adding thoughts as they come up related to this question. And you can trust that we are going to be doing some heavy work of synthesizing these and working with many of you and others to incorporate this feedback into the next round of our recommendations to make these even better and more effective. I want to invite us to go to the next prompt, where we'll do something similar. We'll use this Mentimeter to get your reactions to this question. So this question is, where should we look for inspiration related to implementation of these recommendations? So other communities, vendor requirements, shared service models, maybe it's things beyond what the examples listed here. As we think about implementation of recommendations related to technology and infrastructure in the 911 system, where should we be looking in terms of what is working well, either within the community or in other communities? So similarly, we'll give you a few minutes to think through that, to type in your responses. That Mentimeter link for this question is in the chat, so please go ahead and click on that. I will paste it again here. If you are just joining us, I see our number of participants has ticked up over time, which is amazing. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you. We appreciate the perspectives that you are bringing to this discussion. We are in the Technology and Infrastructure Working Group, and we are talking through the impact, inspiration, and what would make you more supportive of some of the recommendations we've put forward for getting closer to Transform 911's North Star, which is to serve the right person at the right time with the right services in crisis.
I'm noticing with one of these suggestions here around connecting calls for service data to actual dispositions, this is certainly an area that seems to be a challenge for the industry, being able to connect to RMS systems at the police department or criminal history repositories to find out what the final disposition of these cases are. That's certainly an area that that we need to explore as we're trying to make sure we have completeness, a complete picture of this data that we're trying to make decisions on. Another interesting idea was around cloud. If you could scroll up just a little bit to the top. Cloud-based energy systems. I'm curious to learn a little bit more. I think it's always interesting to learn from other industries and other that may have solved similar challenges. So would love to know more about that.
Importantly, if you have connections to folks that are referenced here in terms of inspiring examples that we should look to either within or outside of the communities, we would love to know that. Probably don't share their information here in the chat, but you could ping Mike or myself directly or anyone on the Transform 911 team. We would absolutely love to be connected with some of the folks and include you in those conversations too, if you would like. Open 311 and open referral provide some examples of the possibilities and challenges of data standards and interoperability. Good point. Healthcare electronic records in its vision, discrete manufacturing components, accident and repair history databases, while still covering privacy. Yeah, I think this is absolutely a space that we should look to, is how is that the healthcare system able to do this in terms of managing records and data while still protecting privacy. Can we scroll up?
Can we scroll up a little bit?
Dan, I raised another good point. Many healthcare systems have many of the same interoperability challenges as 911. I think that's absolutely true. How can we identify lessons or ingredients of other issue areas that are working without maybe replicating some of those same challenges? I suspect that we have so much good stuff coming in, it's breaking our Mentimeter. Someone offered here would like to see standards like NENA standards. I think it says something like NENA standards adopted nationwide. Admittedly, there's some challenges to doing this. Would be curious for that person to offer what do you see as the challenges to doing this? Okay, go for it, Mike. Yeah.
I was just going to say there's also a recommendation here to include 511 along the side 211 and 311.
All right, again, please continue to use those Mentimeter links as you have thoughts on these questions. We're going to leverage these heavily in the coming weeks. All right, so our third and final question, what would make you more supportive of these recommendations? Probably the thing I'm most excited about to hear your responses to. Again, you can see the recommendations written out in the chat if you scroll up a little bit, coming from Melissa. What would make you more supportive of these recommendations? that Mentimeter link if you need it again for this question. Just plopped into the chat. Funding coming up in several of these first ones. Seeing some cybersecurity requirements. A group of pilot PSAPs or ECCs who are on board to test new ideas. Yep. I think fortunately we have many folks who are representing ECCs and PSAPs as part of our working groups. So are primed to test some of these ideas. And one of the things we'll be looking at is how do we help make these recommendations a reality and create some kind of blueprints for success.
And I like the idea around federal incentives and requirements for vendors. I think this really is a national effort, and I think you'll be hearing more from some of the other work groups on the need to the need to tackle this as a national problem. Similarly, federal regulation of baseline criteria for services and technology. Another thing I've seen pop up here a couple of places is around philanthropy or grants or funding that supports development of R&D and piloting and testing of this sort of innovation.
I saw one in here about involving community groups from the beginning of the process. I wonder if anyone from Transform 911 or other working groups in the chat might speak to that. It's my understanding that there has been a fair amount of work there, and there can always be more. So curious if anyone else wants to offer some perspective on that. See program evaluations to ensure new programs are working as intended and cost effectively. I would hard +1 that.
I find this comment around answering questions like the race of callers or the subject of interest would be valuable to understand. I'm curious that there's a mention here that there are ways of doing this by accredited researchers. I'm curious to find out more about that. I know that has been a challenge of knowing more about being able to provide more of this information. So if there's anything there, would love to have more information in the comments.
Chad says, we will be speaking to community engagement in the next presentation on ECC operations. Please stick around for their session. It's going to be amazing. More granular acknowledgement of the ongoing and upcoming work inside the community itself. You're doing good work, but there's more going on than is captured here. Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, the work groups themselves are comprised of many folks within the 911 community itself, and there's no way in which the efforts so far are going to be able to capture all of that. So appreciate you raising that, appreciate you being here to offer some of this and help make sure the recommendations are reflective of what you think is going to be most effective within the community.
And any specific, and we certainly welcome any specific recommendations on, standards or efforts that are underway that we may be able to reference or pull from.
Here's a juicy one. The first step in enacting and finding success with any of these recommendations will need to start with a new nationally recognized standard of what 911 and ECCs are and can do. Again, I think the next section is going to speak a little bit to that and the importance of national 911 governance and the support that can provide to the field. So I think there'll be some really good discussion around that one. Federal regulation is needed, yeah, related point. And I see national data collection and standards not just recommended, but required. Again, I think there's a theme emerging here around what does enforcement requirement support at the federal level look like that is able to support people at the local level. Could we scroll back up? See how quickly I can read. Grants and funding coming up again and again. Federal regulation again. See, break some of these items apart. It appears you're trying to lump a ton of things into one bucket. I think that's a good point. There's a lot encompassed in these recommendations. So a round two might provide more granularity within these categories. Knowing how and when they will be shared with elected leaders. I think this is great. Another theme that emerged from our working group conversations and a variety of interviews was the political will needed to implement several of these. I think it's an essential component that may be a part of the next round and the blueprint process over the next several months. All right. I think we can scroll back down. Thank you for allowing us to revisit a few of those early ones. Clear definition of the audience. I think that's a great point. We've hit on a lot of these so far, so we can keep scrolling down. Federal standardization, common theme. Pilot or prototype any new innovation and allow others to see what worked and what didn't before standards are developed. Love this one. This is actually something Code for America is thinking about. We have a national network of volunteers, some of whom are on the call, who are thinking about this as well. What would it look like, especially for the technology recommendations, to begin to pilot, prototype any of these interventions? I know that many of our colleagues here within these working groups are also thinking about what it looks like to pilot some of these within their own ECCs. So I really love this one. I think it speaks to ways in which we can build political will, ways in which we can understand the implementation needs and uncover things that we may not see at the outset. I'm a big fan of that one.
It looks like there is one other message in chat around that we may have missed around telehealth and COVID and plans for incorporating video calls into ECCs. Is this technologically infeasible or even desirable? That's a big part of next generation 911 is the ability to incorporate video, basically multimedia, into emergency response. So that's certainly something that is in the works. I think a little over half the country is already on Next Gen 911, but I don't know how far folks have gone with actually integrating video into emergency call centers. But it is something that it is the promise of Next Gen 911.
We have a few more minutes, so I want to invite us to keep thinking about this question, what would make you more supportive of the recommendations, but also feel free to add in the chat, what did we miss? Um, you're not seeing all of the technology and infrastructure recommendations, so there are others, and you'll be able to access those on the Transform 911 website. But would love your thoughts on, is there something you expected to be part of this set of recommendation that isn't here? Or are there big elements of something we have put forward that isn't captured? So invite you to add that in the chat. What did we miss? What did you expect to be here that isn't here? What should we think about as we move to the next phase of drafting these recommendations, the next round of iteration? Seeing in this one a few more examples of other places we can look for inspiration. I saw Austin PD as an example. I saw, here we see Insights Association, proactively adjust internet privacy and fraud, and have engaged with the FTC. Input and support from other agencies, such as SAMS. Race of callers and IBRS tracks data. Cool, this is great. So regarding the prompt of what's missing, what else would you expect to see here? I see John offered in the chat, with the group name including infrastructure, what were the thoughts about enhancing the actual infrastructure that connects PSAPs and ACCs to one another and the originating service providers? There's much to be done to improve resiliency and connectivity to implement next-gen 911. Absolutely. Tremendous amount of federal investment in broadband infrastructure that unfortunately isn't focused on 911 and public safety. That interoperability is again a theme we heard over and over. Mike will have, as our resident technologist, more eloquent things to say than me about this. And I think that interoperability is something that was informing many of these recommendations in terms of how do we move towards more adoption of next-gen 911? How do we create the conditions where next-gen 911 can also integrate with other alternative service models? How is data a key component of that interoperability? And Mike, what would you add to that great point?
So I think we've definitely identified, for instance, that like originating service providers, the telecommunications companies themselves are kind of a bottleneck in this. If they're not transferring the call over a modern IP-based network, then we lose a lot of the advantages of next-gen 911. And that has impact on the ability for native language support or accessibility and all those things. And I think it's been brought to our attention that, it may be that 80% of these calls are coming in over, more traditional, PTSN type environments where I'm trying not to get too technical on it, but I think the point is that it's that the problem between the caller who's placing the call to 911 and the telecommunicator providing that call to the ECC, that's an important part of this chain. And if that's not modernized, then we're going to have similar challenges, and we're not going to be able to see some of the rewards of upgrading ECCs to next-gen 911. So I think it's something that's been identified. I don't know that there's a recommendation or solution on the table for it, but would be open be open to any suggestions you might have, John, on that. I think that's an important point that we've identified.
I continue to invite others to follow John's example and offer in the chat anything you think is missing in terms of big categories of things that you would expect to be represented in a technology and infrastructure working group and set of recommendations.
I'm curious if that's something that the FCC could regulate. I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
Amy, this is Bree. Do Meredith and Michael for sure know that we're fine with ending early? It feels like they don't.
Hey, we can hear you. We are running a little bit early, which I feel like never happens. So this is a great place to be. It's giving us a lot of space for these conversations. So we likely will end this session a few minutes early, which means we will move to a bit of a transition and then begin our next section. Also want to say that some of the comments here are such a good segue into the ECC operations group, which is coming up next, particularly federal leadership and federal leadership needed to fund states that are behind so that we can even the playing field. Yeah, couldn't have teed up the next group better myself. So from there, we are going to offer our sincere appreciation, gratitude to all of you. 135 people in this session offering really in-depth reactions to these questions, to these recommendations, providing substantive support. Again, for me, these are the moments that reinforce my belief in the power of people coming together behind a shared vision. And we're not going to get to a place where we can reach our North Star without everyone who's here and others who aren't here. So thank you. Deeply appreciate you. I'm so excited to use this to work to the next iteration of our recommendations and include you all in that process.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it as well.
So with that, want to remind everyone that the research we discussed is available in the Transform 911 recommendations, as are the recommendations themselves today and over the next 3 days. So next up, we're going to hear from a 911 professional who has put some of this work into context. And when we return, we'll hand it over to our colleagues Tyrell Morris, Chad Kazmar, and Edwin Hewell-Strunk, who will share with us the recommendations from the Emergency Communication Center Operations Working Group. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your Thursday.
My name is Beth Mackey. I'm a dispatcher out of Rogers County in Oklahoma. We're just outside of Tulsa. I have been a 911 dispatcher for just under 6 months. This job to be stressful. We have a lot that we hear over the phone that we don't necessarily get to find out what happens on the other end, don't necessarily get closure. But it is a very rewarding job that at the end of the day, you know, you went home and you can tell your spouse, you know, we did make a difference today. I performed CPR on the phone for somebody and they lived, or we were able to get responders to a location to ensure someone's safety. So this job definitely has its benefits. There's a lot of downfalls working as a dispatcher. Some people can't handle it. Some people weren't exactly prepared when they started this job for what they would hear and the things that they can't control. So that is a downfall to being a dispatcher. But at the end of the day, what keeps me here is a team that I can lean on when I have a hard call, or a management team that's there for us. And it definitely makes all the hard moments worth being here every day to ensure that our community is safe. as 911 dispatchers, I mean, we are the first line of essentially defense for anybody that calls in, whether they need police, fire, or medical. We are the first person to talk to, first person to get the ball rolling and get the responders. So to me, I would classify all 911 dispatchers and call takers and anyone on radio traffic as a first responder. And I think that's something that should be across the board, not just state level, but federal, because we are the first ones to be on the phone, to be getting responders there. Sometimes, like I said, doing CPR on the phone with these people, or telling them how to do the Heimlich, or telling them to get to a safe spot, or whatever it is that we can do. We are that first line of defense. And I certainly think that more recognition would ensure that people might feel appreciated and want to stay in this job, because it is a hard job, and to not be recognized and people just think, oh, they're just the police officer secretary. Like, it's not how it is at all. We have so much more beyond just doing things for the officers, and I don't think people necessarily understand that.
Thank you all very much for participating in that really wonderful conversation with Meredith and Mike on 911 technology. And thank you, Beth, for sharing your story with us. We will break for just a few moments, and in about 5 minutes, we will start the ECC operations conversation. So thank you again for your participation with us over the past plus hour, and we look forward to you joining us in just a few minutes.